Hello, this is Dr. Marco Tavanti showing this PowerPoint presentation as a way to interact with you and reflect on this important topic of connecting human rights with sustainable development. We'll be doing this along with my friend, colleague, and international expert, Dr. Alfredo Sfeir Younis, which has been pre-recorded here on video presentation. The needs for putting together those two concepts have been exemplified in the struggles of many indigenous people in their search for human rights and sustainable development. You will also hear the reflections of Dr. Alfredo Sfeir Younis in framing sustainable development in the field of values and in relation to rights, environmental rights, human rights, and property rights. We will then show how these approaches fits with the idea of human rights sustainable development and the model that we propose, which is this integrated model, along with recommendations that are visible and readable in our paper in more details. In my life of working with indigenous populations, particularly in South America, we recognize the connection between environmental rights, food rights, security, and human rights. They, the people of the earth, they seek justice, life quality, a betterment of their human conditions that is inherently related to the rights of nature and environmental rights, including property rights, including intellectual property rights, which are continuously increasingly the struggles for many indigenous populations. So the recognition of the connection between human indigenous rights with nature and land rights is at the core of this paper, but also at the core of the contemporary reflections and understanding of sustainable development. Poverty is obviously not something that is conducive to sustainability, neither in the human life and the social and economic development of indigenous people, or even in the preservations and the protection of natural resources.
The topic of sustainable development can be looked into from many different perspectives. Most people think that the topic is just about ecology and environment. But actually, even to talk about ecology and environment, there are many ways to understand this. One way is to think about sustainable development as a next step to socio-economic development. If one look at the sequence, the first part of the sequence is economic growth, how fast an economy can run. The second one is who benefits from the economy, which is socioeconomic development. And then the third one is how long this will last, whether this pattern of growth and development leads to sustainability. But actually one can look at it in a very different way. For example, one can look at sustainable development as a debate on value systems, whether the values of the market, whether the values of nature, whether ethical values or moral values should guide decisions regarding our future. And in this sense, the reason why sustainable development can be seen as a value system is because the early debate on the ecological movement was to claim that the market gives values that end up punishing, destroying the environment. So many people will say a tree has not only a value in terms of use, which is what the market actually prices, but a tree, a freestanding tree, might have a value, an ecological value in terms of its DNA, in terms of its capacity to provide shade, in terms of regulation of winds, and many, many other things that a tree does, in addition to the spiritual value of a tree. But there is another way that concerns us today, which is to look at sustainable development as a human right. In other words, that people have the right for a clean environment. People had the right to live in societies that are sustainable. But this right is not a direct right, it's usually a derived right. And so the creation of this environmental right is based on the jurisprudence of many other forms of rights. For example, the right to life, the right to information, the right to clean water, the right to housing, the right to food. Many of these rights that have a jurisprudence that is understood, is accepted, and there are many international treaties on these rights, are providing a support for an overall jurisprudence in the maintenance, the management, the appropriation, and the use of our natural environment. And I think that it's very important for people to see sustainable development as a debate on rights, because rights are always accompanied by responsibility. And the question we are asking all the time is, what is the responsibility of someone who destroys the environment? For example, a factory might pollute a river. Okay, maybe this is an outcome of production, but the question is, who is responsible for cleaning this river? And most of the time, there is an imbalance between those who create the environmental problem and those who pay for the environmental problem. I was in a region in Portugal that it was a fruit producing region, and they use fertilizer, pesticides, and hormones. But in my little farm, I had organic production, and I ended up paying with my own health because of the pesticide, because the pesticide flies in the air. So they gain from producing fruit, they sell the fruit, they make money, but they're not paying the abatement and the health cost that I go through because of their actions. So there is a need for a normative system that will regulate and at least make explicit who is the source of this pollution, and then who has the responsibility to deal with that pollution. So should I pay for my healthcare system, or should the fruit producing people pay for my health? Naturally, the best outcome is that my health is not affected by anyone, but we live in an interdependent world. The same thing happens, with regard to global warming, the production of CO2. Some countries produce more CO2 than others, but the destruction of the ozone layer doesn't occur exactly where the largest production of CO2 is. So the question is, who pays for that and who has the responsibility? So because rights and responsibility go hand in hand, the debate on the rights to the environment have been fueled by very interesting discussions on the responsibility to take care of the environment, or clean the environment, or repair the environment, or bring the environment back to where it was. In addition to that, there is a question about the extent to which human rights exist for future generations. We know very well that the earth needs to be kept at least in the same way we receive it, or better. This is not the case now, because the total is less than the sum of the parts. We are consuming more minerals, we're destroying more land, we are exhausting and depleting more biodiversity resources. So there is a big question as to whether future generations have rights. They are not here, so how could they have rights? But there is a general consensus now that future generations do have rights, and basically we need to make sure that we do not constrain, we do not limit the ability of future generations to live in this planet. So who has the responsibility? There must be a normative system, a set of rights that is capable to address that issue. Last but not least is the fact that as we doubt or discussed whether future generations have rights, there is another discussion taking place for the last decade, which is whether nature has rights. Whether nature is a live entity, and if it has rights, then the question is who will protect those rights and who will make sure that those rights are in place so that nature is respected in the way it should be. We have one case which is very interesting in Ecuador, the constitutional change that gives right to nature. And that implies that citizens, as well as government, need to have a special behavior so that these rights are implemented. So it's not that easy anymore to download your waste in the river near your house, because actually someone will come up in this normative system to say, look, you cannot pollute this river, the river has rights, and it's not only you have rights, but there is a balance here between human rights of human and rights of nature. There is another debate on human rights or rights in general and sustainable development, which has to do with the forms of protection of a natural resource so that the tragedy of the commons doesn't take place. Most of the time it is argued that we exhaust the natural resource beyond its critical point because there are no incentives to frugality. In other words, there is no incentive to non-use. Most of the incentives are for more use, more growth, more this, more. There is no incentive for less. So there are certain situations where the sustainable development objectives are not attained because we don't have a system of rights that eliminate, the causes that are being created in terms of resource use. This is the case of the tragedy of the commons, where the people don't have incentives to take the sheep out of the prairie. So it was suggested in 1968 by Garrett Harding that we should privatize the commons, in other words, to allocate property rights to it. The same thing at all levels, in urban areas, how to allocate land rights, so poor people have better environment. They say that people who don't have rights to the land will not have incentive to preserve the land. They will just use it and abandon the land. This is happening in the Amazon, this is happening in many places. So rights seem to have an impact in human behavior in relationship to the environment that is affected for the assignment of right. And there is a long discussion about private right, collective right, secondary rights, informal rights, and so on. So it's important that we understand the relationship between rights and development, human right and sustainable development. And I would suggest that actually we will never be able to attain sustainable development without a proper set of rights, a proper set of norms.
So this new framework of understanding sustainable development within the issue of values and human rights is actually is a development in itself from the discussion that emerged in the 80s about human development in relation to human rights, which has generated numerous programs and approaches by NGOs and governmental institutions that focus more on the development of institutional capacity, government capacity, that recognize the rights and responsibility of governments as well as the rights of the participants and the recipients. So within this, the model that we suggest is based on this idea of rights and duties in all the three spheres of sustainability that we are all familiar with, the so-called three pillars of sustainability. But that for us, particularly in relation to indigenous people, this reflects the fourth pillar that for us and for indigenous populations is represented by culture and diversity. In this case, they're all integrated within the idea of human rights, sustainable development as institutional capacities, as development of participation. And in particularly for us, this represents a few specific recommendations that has to do with linking more academic support and programs that looks at the interaction of these different frameworks by developing more governmental programs and institutions that protects indigenous rights and human rights, and also by the recognition of the paradigms as a central element into the issue of human security in itself that comprehends all these issues. So human rights helps to understand and reframe sustainable development along this line. For additional comments, you might check our paper and our specific recommendations, and we will be happy to hear from you. You can email me at the email address listed above. Thank you very much and have a sustainable life. Bye-bye.